Good morning, and thank you, Sophia, for the introduction. This event brings together two very special things to me, the University of Michigan and sustainability. I can't wait to hear what the panel has to say about them this morning. I am personally based in Egypt, where climate change is an increasingly a topic of increasing awareness. It's contributing to the water shortage in the country. We're all very, very keen to see things improve on that front. But first, I'm pleased to introduce Steve Grafton, the president and CEO of the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan. Since 1994, Steve has provided leadership and direction to the association across all campuses. He is a national leader in the educational advancement field, serving many leadership roles for the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. And on a personal note, Steve and his wife Carol have two sons who are alumni. Steve Grafton, welcome.
Thank you, Omar. It's so great to see you this morning and all of our participants. It's great to be with all of you. And let me just say, Happy New Year. To many of you on this call, I can say also an early Happy New Year. It's really wonderful that you've all joined us this morning. It's just such a disappointing thing not to be able to gather together this year for the Pan-Asia Alumni Reunion like we normally would. And I missed it last year, had looked forward perhaps to that coming back this year, and am disappointed again that we can't be physically together. But this is great because we can include a lot of people and still learn a lot and maintain our connection. I often say that there have been a lot of things that have been negative about COVID, but one thing that will never happen, and that's that it will not defeat the unity of the Michigan family. We're still together, and that's great. And we have this great program for you today. I'm really excited about it. Like Omar said, I'm also excited to learn. It's a very important issue. We talk about the international climate crisis that we have. There's a lot that we need to be talking about and learning about, and frankly, there's a lot we need to do, and we'll hear about that. And who better to moderate a discussion about climate crisis than one of the world's experts in climate change, especially when she is from our own University of Michigan. Jennifer Haverkamp is the Graham Family Director of the University of Michigan's Graham Sustainability Institute. And she also holds positions at the Michigan Law School and the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. And currently is co-chairing Michigan President Schlissel's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, a very important project for the university. Professor Haverkamp has held several positions related to trade and environment at the very highest levels of our United States government, and has taught at the Cornell and George Washington University Law Schools, as well as the Johns Hopkins Graduate School. So clearly, Professor Haverkamp has much to offer, and I'm just thrilled that she is sharing her expertise with us today as she moderates this tremendous panel. So please join me in welcoming Professor and Director Jennifer Haverkamp.
Steve, thank you so much for that kind introduction. The good news is that I'm joined by three incredible representatives of the University of Michigan community, faculty, and alumni, and we have a lot that we want to share with you, and we want to spend a significant chunk of the time also answering your questions. Before I turn to our panelists, I want to just say a little bit to frame the topic, talk about the climate crisis, international climate diplomacy, and say a little more about what the University of Michigan ourselves are doing on climate change. Urgency of the climate problem, it is no longer a problem of the future. The impacts are already being felt. You can see this in more intense storms, droughts, fish stocks moving to colder waters that are changing the local economies. It seems like it's in the news constantly this week. The latest news is a study that released on Monday that reports that global ice is melting at the rate of the worst case scenarios of the scientists who'd been studying this. which means that the sea level rise anticipated from melting ice sheets may have been underestimated by at least a factor of 2. Here at the University of Michigan, it's very much an issue of concern by our students, and you can understand why. Every year in the lives of our current undergraduates has been well above the 20th century's average in terms of temperature, and 9 of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2005. Unfortunately, we're on track for 3 to 4 degrees of global warming. If we do not take action globally, we urgently need to limit that to 1.5 degrees of warming, which means, according to the scientists, global scientists who comprise the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that means that we need by 2030 globally a 45% reduction in emissions from 2010 levels. And by 2050, mid-century, we need to reach global neutrality, meaning a balance between what is emitted and what gets absorbed back into the ocean, into the trees, or is technologically removed. So how are countries trying to deal with this issue globally, diplomatically? I'm sure you've all heard of the Paris Climate Agreement. You probably also know that it really doesn't have anything to do with France. It's named the Paris Agreement because Paris is where that agreement was concluded, and that's the global convention. In this agreement, briefly, countries agreed to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade and to try to reach that 1.5 degrees that I mentioned. The agreement is sometimes criticized as being toothless because it is not binding. I noticed that one of the questions we got from audience in advance was to ask, how do you make it legally enforceable? Briefly, certain parts of it are binding obligations around reporting and accounting for what you're doing, but the basic core commitments of the agreement that countries make are in fact non-binding, they're voluntary, but that was essential, frankly, to getting this agreement in the first place, because you were never going to get countries like the United States, developed countries, making binding commitments unless major emerging economies like China also did so. They were not prepared to make binding commitments, and so the result was that everyone has these nationally determined contributions, which each country sets on its own. So these were all set in 2015 when the agreement was reached. The next thing that is supposed to happen, this is quite important, the very next annual meeting of the UN Climate Convention in Glasgow, Scotland, next November, is where countries come back with their new, hopefully improved and strengthened nationally determined commitments. This event was supposed to happen this past December, but between Brexit and COVID, it's been postponed a year, which is probably a good thing because it means that countries will also see what the United States, now that it has rejoined this agreement, is willing to do with respect to its nationally determined contribution, which will hopefully also inspire others to greater ambition. You can expect a lot of diplomatic activity between now and November as countries come forward with their new commitments. The European Commission has already, the European Union has already announced a $1 trillion Green Deal, which is intended to reduce their emissions and foster economic growth. The other country that everyone is watching very closely is China. The fact that China and the United States came together in 2014 to announce our commitments was what paved the way for the Paris Agreement. China has announced an updating of their commitment already, which is to peak their emissions before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060. That can be after 2050 as an emerging economy. But the problem with China is that they continue to have a very heavy reliance on coal. They need to phase out their use of coal by 2040, and they are still building new coal plants. And a quarter of all new coal being built around the world is financed by China or its companies. It's probably not a coincidence that in the last 3 years, China was relaxing its strict requirements on new coal plants, given that since 2017, the United States also has been reversing and delaying our policies to reduce our fossil fuel emissions. So as that changes in the US, watch what happens in other countries as well. And as you know, President Biden on his first day announced that the US was rejoining the agreement. Also, no longer Secretary Kerry, his special climate advisor, John Kerry, announced on Monday the US is going to fulfill a commitment of $3 billion to something called the Green Climate Fund that Jennifer Lakey might speak more about, which is a fund for developing countries to mitigation and adaptation. Briefly, before I pan over to our panelists, the University of Michigan. President Schlissel committed the university to a pathway to carbon neutrality and created a commission to come up with recommendations in that regard, which I co-chair. Our commission has draft recommendations out for public comment. We will finalize our report and deliver it to the president and the regents in the end of February. We're in a cold climate and it's an expensive and difficult proposition, but the university wants to lead and is prepared to lead on this issue. We're kind of a microcosm of the globe because to succeed, we need the involvement of the entire University of Michigan community, the technology, the cultural shifts, and we're also similarly trying to really ramp up the university's research with respect to carbon neutrality. There's a new fund for faculty research, and the Graham Institute, which I am the director of, along with the School of Environment and Sustainability, as well as engineering, are hosting some clean energy conversations for faculty to come together, explore the real world problems that most need their attention, and identify opportunities to collaborate. Now for our panel. These panelists have really deep and wide expertise. A common theme that you might hear across them is around the challenges and opportunities that are presented by the built environment, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the activities and the infrastructure of our global megacities, and how they need to transition quickly to a low carbon economy and to become resilient to their already changing climate. Of course, it's not limited to cities, but there's a common expertise across our panelists in that realm. First, you'll hear from Jennifer Lakey, who's the Global Director of the Energy Program at the World Resources Institute, and is also an alum of the School of Natural Resources and the Ross School of Business. After Jennifer, you will hear from Brian Sweat, Principal and Group Leader of ARUP, who is also the Director of Cities and Sustainable Real Estate for ARUP in the Americas. Brian, too, is an alum of the School of Natural Resources and Ross. And finally, our own distinguished professor of engineering, Victor Lee, who is also professor of civil and environmental engineering, professor of materials science and engineering, and professor of macromolecular science and engineering. And with that, I turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer, and to all of you, good evening, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be here. As Global Director of World Resources Institute's Energy Program, I'm involved in activities associated with the development of renewable energy resources, energy efficiency, and energy access around the world. And today I wanted to focus a little bit more on some of the challenges that we're facing in scaling investments and finance in order to manage the very significant shift in our energy sector that's required in order to tackle climate change. The energy sector is been dominated by fossil fuels. And at this point, we have a wonderful inflection point. This is truly one of the bright spots in the climate change story. We're at an inflection point where many renewable electricity generation sources, wind and solar, geothermal, hydropower, are all, in 2/3 of the world, are all competitive or under the cost of fossil fuel-based power technologies. So the question I think facing us in this space is, what do we need to do to change the business patterns that have perpetuated the development of these types of resources? So how do we move from an understanding in our major institutions and in our policies of creating economic development through coal plants, through gas plants, and through oil and petroleum, and move to a renewable future? WRI, along with the Climate Works Foundation, launched a report in the fall on the state of climate action. In that report, we found that despite the significant changes in the economics associated with renewable energy, we are still not on track. We need to increase investment and the financing of renewable energy or renewable electricity in particular, still 6 times more quickly than we have actually made those investments to date. And to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge, we also recognize that the transition to electric vehicles, which of course from a technological standpoint is lagging behind where we are in renewable energy, we needed to increase transportation by 22 times the amount of investment and the speed of the transition. So we know that the technologies are there. These really are institutional challenges. And I want to comment very briefly on a few of the things that we are seeing as mechanisms for that change. And I want to first note that in a partnership that we've had this past year with the International Solar Alliance, which was established as a funding mechanism for developing countries to do South-South collaboration on technology in solar in particular, India and France established an intergovernmental group. And in our work with them, we found that the world is currently developing solar in about 10 countries at the pace that you need to do to decarbonize based on using solar resources. And so now the question is, how do we bring those technologies, that investment, to the rest of the world? There are a number of mechanisms and approaches that are required, but one could look at both the public space and the private sector space as indicators of where we're going to go. On the public side, we are seeing large pension funds and institutions start to stand up additional investments into renewable energy. The Danish pension funds in particular, California's pension funds, and many others are either committing to divest of fossil resources in their investments or to move forward with a specific portfolio indication or set-asides or entirely changing their investment trajectories. So those are very, very promising. However, we also see that state-owned or sanctioned or state agencies are continuing to invest in coal and fossil fuel, as Jennifer mentioned. So there is the need for national governments not only to commit to what they're going to do in their countries, but also what they will be doing in terms of global and overseas investment. China's Belt and Road Initiative is one of those that we're watching very closely because in our early analysis, it has largely been dominated by fossil fuel and extractive industries, which are not helping us move in the right direction. One final point, and then I'll pass it over to Brian. We know that in the economic recovery plans from most countries around the world, the number of jobs that are associated with energy efficiency and renewable energy vastly outstrip over time the number of jobs that would be in a fossil fuel-based economy. The data in the United States has been compelling and elsewhere as well. But we have seen that most governments in their COVID response packages and stimulus programs have continued to reinforce existing infrastructure over new infrastructure. There are a number of programs in countries, and let me point to Vietnam as one that I think is going to be very important and to watch. They actually had a goal for solar and for renewable energy build out, and their utility found that through their tariff structure, they were able to get 5 times more renewables deployed in this past year than they had expected. That's a significant change of pace. So we know that there are efforts underway in many countries. We know that the investment interest is there from the private sector and from institutional investors. And now we need to change business practices and policy strategies. And let me say that there is no one sector more poised to be able to deliver on sustainable development, improving people's lives, than the building sector and the infrastructure in cities. Our cities are our engines of growth, and we're excited to see what they can contribute in terms of investment and changing practice. So with that, in my introduction, let me pass it over to Brian for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you, Michigan, for inviting me. It's great to be involved in a virtual Michigan event. My name is Brian Sweat. And as mentioned, I am the city's leader and sustainable real estate leader for Arup in the Americas. We are a design, engineering, and planning firm headquartered in London, global in our operations, around 15,000 people strong. And I think I'll pick up the gauntlet from where Jennifer handed it off on the other issues that set the context for the challenge of decarbonization that we're facing around the world. Because decarbonization alone would be a significant enough problem, but it needs to happen in the context of both dealing with some of those speed bumps between now and a fully decarbonized economy around the world by 2050, and addressing other major societal issues at the same time. And we have no choice but to address them in a comprehensive manner. Those who are based in the US are seeing certainly that tone come out of the Biden administration, that it's not climate change action and other stuff, when we can get to it, it has to be integrated. So just to briefly touch on 6 of the big themes that I'm focused on. And as Jennifer mentioned, one of the big themes is that we are dealing with decarbonizing our globe and decarbonizing our economy in a period in time in which humanity is the most urban it has ever been. We now have more than half of the people around the world living in some form of an urban context, which is very different and provides both opportunities and challenges in terms of how we transition our infrastructure, our way of life, to a net zero carbon approach. The other variables that I'm focused on, and that we at Arup are focused on keenly as we move in this direction, one is clearly addressing growing inequality and growing attention to racial justice, attention to income inequality. Our solutions to decarbonizing the economy around the world need to address not only country to country inequality, but also the inequality that exists within most countries in terms of environmental justice, environmental impact, how we built out our energy infrastructure 75 to 100 years ago, and making sure that we don't make the same mistakes and we redress those issues in a way that embeds justice in all of our actions. Aging infrastructure is another theme that we're looking at very specifically. As most folks know, many countries around the world have underinvested in their infrastructure for decades. There is a bill to be coming due, regardless of the fact that we also need to decarbonize on our bridge infrastructure, our road infrastructure, our rail infrastructure, our grids. Usually we pay less attention to anything that we can't see. So a lot of these issues are underground and we wait for things to break. So our aging infrastructure is going to be a problem throughout the next 3 decades as we decarbonize our systems as well. Increasing climate risk. At the top of this, I've never seen a piece of science that makes me less concerned about climate change impacting our world, and the fact that we may have been underestimating sea level rise by that magnitude is absolutely terrifying. We know that significant portions of where humanity is located and where our infrastructure that supports our way of life globally is within several feet of sea level rise, several feet of high tide today. And so increasing climate risk, be it storm events, be it droughts, be it wildfires, or decarbonization of the economy in the world needs to happen in a context of being resilient to those environments that are going to be with us, the embedded climate change that our emissions have already put into force. A fifth one is around, and I think Jennifer did a great job of capturing some of the hope and progress, but our fifth one is, in my mind, is really around the funding gap. If you add up the amount of the resources we need to change our infrastructure, and it's absolutely correct that renewable energy on a point-to-point is economically competitive in many parts of the world with fossil fuel-based infrastructure, but the funding gap is really about changing our entire supply through distribution, through end-use network. And there's a massive funding gap between where we need to go and where historically we've been. Most countries around the world have again been underinvesting in infrastructure going forward, and the ability to simply raise taxes and return to a post World War II era public sector investment in infrastructure. Very few politicians are holding out hope for that model. So we'll need to develop new public-private partnership models and new ways of leveraging equity and of better cost sharing and aligning benefits and costs. A fifth major issue that we're looking at in a very detailed way is the digital transformation that we're all living through right now. It provides both opportunities and challenges. Having grids that are truly smart and can in real time react to both disruptions as well as changes in supply and demand have massive opportunities making sure that our systems operate in a carbon efficient way. But as we've seen through numerous disruptions around the world, Tying everything together also opens up ourselves to larger points of failure. And these can be just by happenstance, or they can be man-made in the sense of digital terrorism. But we need to be cognizant of tying things together in a digital way that takes advantage of the opportunities while it mitigates the risks. Excuse me. And then lastly, within this urgency of decarbonization that all of this is happening in terms of designing our economic systems and our infrastructure systems to support a net zero carbon future by mid-century, we also have to be cognizant of how we transition and build out that infrastructure that gets us there, because it's not solely about the operating carbon efficiency of this equipment. It's also about the embodied carbon of that infrastructure that we need to put in place. So we will be investing massively around the world in new infrastructure, and we need to make sure we're doing it in a carbon efficient way, in a low carbon way. And so our material choices matter, in particular in the built environment. Our embodied carbon needs to be much more of a factor in terms of both our heavy infrastructure and our buildings. And we need to think through the long-term effect and really take a life cycle carbon approach to how we build out a fully decarbonized infrastructure. Which is a great segue to Professor Lee. So I'd love to turn it over to Victor, who's doing some excellent work on exactly that topic, on the opportunities we have and the technologies we have before us as we build out this environment in a low carbon way.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you to the two Jennifers and Brian for laying out the background. I'm delighted to be here to share some thoughts with you and also share some very exciting technologies we are developing at the University of Michigan. Let me see if I can bring up my slides. Just a couple of slides. Let's see. Okay. Are you able to see my slides now? Okay. All right. Okay, so as a civil engineer, we are always very proud to make the claim of building civilization. We are responsible for buildings, highway systems, water dams, and so on. The challenge, however, the negative side of this thinking is that the civil building environment is also responsible for a lot of the carbon emissions. So if you take a look at this map here, these are big cities, major cities with populations over 1 million people. And there are 33 of them currently, and more coming along the way, 6 more by the year 2030. Every one of these big cities are going to require or have required huge amount of infrastructures. What's the problem with infrastructure? So according to the United Nations, construction and buildings accounts for 40% of global carbon emissions. Okay. A lot of it is coming from concrete, which is one of the most popular materials for construction applications. So if you look at this chart here, concrete occupies more than 80% of all materials that we use. It's second only to water. And it's not surprising, therefore, that we see headlines like this, concrete is tipping us into climate catastrophe. So it's payback time. This is in the Guardians. And the question is, what can we do? What needs to be done to decarbonize the built environment? So let me see if I can okay, here. So here's a new kind of concrete we developed in our laboratory at the University of Michigan. And the material can take carbon from the industrial waste streams, including flue gas, and create carbon mineralization into this material, permanently sequestering the gaseous carbon, turning this into a very durable construction material that are now used back in infrastructure, essentially creating a closed loop or a circular pathway for carbon. Instead of looking at carbon as a bad pollutant, we look at it as a resource, in other words. Okay, so the specific technology we have developed actually have two parts. One is applies to precast products, and the other applies to cast-in-place construction. So the precast products, we can now go up to about 10% by weight of carbon sequestration, and the cast-in-place about 5%. So these are huge amounts. If fully scaled, we're talking about gigatons of carbon sequestered in construction materials and for the built environment around the world. So where are we now? This technology actually has gone out into the real world. So these infrastructures that you see in front of you, they are already built. Some of these are new construction, others are repair and retrofits. This uses a version that has not have the carbon sequestration, but is very durable in the sense that it is bendable under extreme loads. In fact, this building is in Tokyo area. And for those of you who are in Asia, you recognize this Tokyo Tower in the background. So a lot of these constructions are now utilizing the extreme ductility and durability of this material that is absent in normal concrete material. So our plan is to pilot the carbon sequestered version of bendable concrete or ECC in the coming year, and hopefully introduce that to the market in the next few years to help in decarbonizing the built environment and tackle the climate challenge as we move along. So I'll be happy to answer any questions, but let me move back to the panel. Jennifer, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Victor and Jennifer and Brian, for wonderful introductory comments. And for all of you Michigan engineering alums out there, I hope you enjoyed the picture of the North Campus in Victor's last slide. One of the things that we have been talking about is the incredible urgency of this transition. And I would like to start this conversation by asking each of you, what are some ways to accelerate the transition that you see are needed, especially in the policy space? What are things that the governments can do, whether it's procurement, whether it's building codes? What do we need to move more quickly, as quickly as we need, to this new low carbon economy? And Jennifer, maybe I'll start with you.
Great question. Well, there are a couple of things that are specifically important for government. First of all, I mentioned already the stimulus or dollars associated with the economic recovery. To date, in G20 countries, they spent $212 billion on fossil fuels in their recovery, and clean energy received $139 billion. So we clearly need to rebalance in terms of our public spending. The second thing is really government as a force of change. In the United States, for example, the use of energy performance contracting allowed for a rapid deployment of both work and jobs into energy efficiency in the last economic recession in the United States, and investment to move there. So the government can use its pull factor. The private sector does as well. I've worked with companies around the world through the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance to actually set procurement standards and work in their supply chains to request renewable energy projects as part of their business practice. So you can do that with cement. California is looking at that. There are a number of different initiatives. It's really important to use both the investment dollars and where you place those dollars and the pull factor of opportunities to procure or purchase these products.
Great. Victor, you want to weigh in?
Sure. Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that the construction industry is a relatively conservative industry as far as technology is concerned. So left by on its own, is going to take a long time. Now, the conservativeness is really, there are good reasons behind that. But the fact of the matter is that slows down innovation adoption. Okay, so policy really is important, and technology is not enough by itself. So I see, as Jennifer mentioned, in some cities like Marin County in California, and I believe New York is also adopting this low carbon concrete requirements to build in those counties. And those are very helpful. I also understand some people would say the federal government is perhaps the biggest purchaser of concrete. They're responsible for our highway systems, which uses a lot of concrete materials. So there are opportunities like that to drive technology into the marketplace, into adoption.
So that's Marin County in New York City. I would encourage all of you joining this from around the world to do what you can to encourage your own governments to improve these standards. Brian, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues and add a couple of things. One, I think you've heard a bit about governance. I think there are very few countries around the world, as well as sort of subnational governments that are set up to most optimally get us to a decarbonized economy in 2050. So I think one area of work in particular for universities is to think through what are the governance structures that enable us to prioritize carbon as a metric of success in every decision we make. And you're seeing the messaging coming out of the Biden administration now, and I'm based out of Boston, that carbon needs to be a decision-making factor for every government agency, for every decision they're making going forward, if we're going to have a chance at this success. It cannot be compartmentalized in an environment agency, at the city, state, local, federal, provincial levels. This has to be a whole government movement. The other thing I'd add is, and I'm a massive fan of technology and innovation and policies that move the vanguard and of what's possible. I was one of the founders of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which was the group of the vanguard cities around the world that have commitments, real commitments, by 2050 or earlier to be carbon neutral. That is absolutely important, but that will not get us there, right? I think we need to be honest with ourselves that we are woefully under the pace we need to decarbonize the world. And what that means to me is we need to start regulating the bottom bar of the different systems that we have in the country and in the world, and saying by some date certain, the current carbon intensive technology will no longer be permitted to be used. So you're seeing that happen a bit in Europe about commitments to saying every car will be electric or carbon free by a certain date by a date certain in France. I think we need the same thing in the US on oil-based heating. We need to put a marker out there, and it doesn't need to be tomorrow, but if we were saying by 2030, we will not be having, we will not replace oil furnaces with oil furnaces. We need air-to-air heat pumps. There are technologies that exist, and it's our own sort of human inertia and the inertia of our business systems that are preventing us from the rapid pace of adoption. And so carrots, the old carrot and stick model, carrots will not get us there, right? We're going to have to move some sticks, and we're going to have to do that more expeditiously than I think people realize to change our economies fast enough. And that doesn't mean, to be clear, it doesn't mean it'll cost folks more. We are currently making, as Jennifer in her lead-in remarks noted, we are currently making economically irrational decisions today because they're just easier decisions to deal with in our existing supply and implementation marketplace. But they're still economically irrational.
Thank you. Also, I want to encourage back and forth amongst the panelists. So if any of you wish to comment on each other's remarks, please just raise your hand and I'll call on you. But while you're thinking about that, Jennifer, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to mention, Brian, I thought your comment there about the need for subnational governance and to recognize the role that different levels of government play. In the electricity sector, this is a huge disconnect, right? I mean, we have national governments or state governments that generally plan for investment and approve the types of construction of new resources or infrastructure. And yet cities are the ones, as you mentioned, that are often on the vanguard of looking out for their citizens in terms of the concerns they may have about what climate change may do to cities and heat. and the need for infrastructure investments in their economies. But they don't have a role often in the electricity governance. So we're seeing a lot of this disconnect happening between cities and the energy sector in ways that are going to be potentially create more conflict and less alignment than we would hope to see otherwise. I mean, you've seen in South Africa, Cape Town, trying to figure out how it's going to manage in the context of Eskom, its utility, which is not moving where the Cape Town wants it to be moving as quickly. You've seen that in the United States as well, in Colorado. So we know that these tensions exist and they're only going to get worse rather than faster, could tie us up in court rather than allow these types of new innovations to occur in a way that aligns the investment.
Thank you. Good, Brian?
Yeah, I'd agree with that completely. And we can't be, just to pick up on your last sentence there of winding up in court, we cannot worry about being sued to get there, right? And I think, and folks in the U.S. certainly heard Chuck Schumer calling for it. We are in today a national climate emergency. We need to declare it as such in all countries around the world to give us the tools necessary to reset our economy. Because if the choice is between current shareholder equity and setting up the right corporate structures and quasi-government agencies that can get there, we need to solve this crisis. Solving this crisis is a necessity, and we will deal with the financial implications of making folks whole that may have been misled into making bad investments or operating under old regimes. That cannot prevent us from making the change we need to avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of you talked about private sector issues in finance. Jennifer, you said the investment interest was there. Brian, you talked about the underinvestment. Victor, you talked about the conservatism in the building sector. What are some specific things that would help move those dollars more quickly to where they need to be spent?
So I can start with that. So we already mentioned that policies is very helpful. Technology by itself is not enough. But I agree that the private sector, there is a lot to do, both on the supply side and the demand side of technologies and innovations. And I'm referring to the whole value chain of construction, all the way from finance to developers, to owners, to users, as well as the AEC community, the architecture engineering community. So this whole value chain of construction is very complicated and often fragmented. And this is a major challenge. How do we actually decarbonize the built environment that requires all these moving parts to work together? That to me is one of the major challenges. If we can solve that problem, creating alignment between these various entities with both common and sometimes mismatched interests. How do we do that? If we can solve that problem, I believe that this kind of technology to decarbonize the built environment. Remember earlier I mentioned about 40% comes from the built environment, the carbon emissions. If we can only take away half of that, that's a big chunk. Mm-hmm. And so there is no time to lose. We have to move very urgently forward, utilizing all talents from the different entities, sectors that are involved in the built environment.
Great.
Yeah, I think I think one of the challenges and opportunities with the built environment, in particular, some of the heavy infrastructure we've been talking about, is that the decisions we make today will be with us in 2050 and towards the end of the century, right? In terms of power plants, stations, bridges, roads. Most of the buildings that we're building today have longer than a 30-year life. So for me, we need to
call our built facilities monuments.
Yeah,
they last for so long, and that actually has strong implications in terms of carbon. If we build these infrastructures today with not so durable concrete, we're going to be doing a lot of maintenance, and the operational carbon becomes extremely important. That's something that we have to worry about. So I think Jennifer mentioned that it's not enough to look at just the embodied carbon, but also the operation carbon or vice versa. We need to deal with both of them at once.
Great. Brian, you had something else to add?
You know, it was sort of the how to Victor's challenge, which to me is we've been operating for most of the time around the world with design-based standards for our built environment, not performance-based standards. And so we need to rapidly move to a carbon performance standard. You know, one of the aspects about the new administration in Washington, I know I've mentioned this a bunch, but that's my frame of reference. And there's some countries around the world that are ahead of us in this, is developing a carbon performance standard for both new and existing buildings. And that's embedded in the Biden-Harris plan. I am sure we will not be successful if we don't even define what success looks like, right? And if carbon performance of our built environment is an element of success, it needs to be explicit. And that doesn't necessarily mean from day one, but it means addressing the issues that Victor mentioned of both performance and embodied. And it means that every piece of infrastructure and building that we're building today should have a pathway, a concrete defined pathway to carbon neutrality. Otherwise, it's a step backwards, right? It's more carbon we're going to have to sequester down the line, and that's not in a position we want to be in globally.
Great. So along the way, we've been answering some of the questions that have been coming in from members of the audience, but I'd like to turn to a few specific ones or categories of questions that we've been getting. One of the themes across several of the questions is the disparities between developed and developing countries. And Brian, you were talking about the need for equity at the individual level within a country as well as across countries. But can folks say a little bit more about how to address the equity of development while addressing climate change?
So I think I'm happy to start on that one and buy some time for my colleagues, because there's a suite of solutions, and there are very different approaches to this. So one is certainly we're learning more, and actually the University of Michigan is doing some great research on this as an ag school on the importance of our natural environment in sequestering carbon. And the economic value of carbon sinks around the world continues to be something that we've done a really poor job of monetizing. So whether or not it's our peat forests in Southeast Asia, whether or not it's our rainforests in the Amazon or our temperate rainforests in northern Russia and Canada, these are places that literally are carbon sinks in sort of the lungs of the planet. That economically it makes a lot of sense to protect now. And to make those transfer payments to not lose that, rather than try to sequester that carbon through some technological means. And so there will be significant transfer payments, and there's been a reluctance globally that you mentioned in terms of the equity of countries making commitments, and taking steps forward, where we need to actually create a global, robust, performance-based carbon market that investments in the natural environment can be part of that solution. In addition to the appropriate technology transfers, so that when we're building out the energy infrastructure in the developing world, it's done day one from a carbon neutral perspective. And the technologies exist. I mean, as was mentioned, we can do that. But the economic inequity of making that first investment needs to be addressed from those countries that are better off right now.
That's just such an excellent point, I think. The amount of carbon that is stored in these land uses, in the forests, the peat, it's going to be so much harder to recapture that through planting trees than it is to keep it where it is. But we're losing the peat, we're losing the rainforest because of the need for economic development, because it's not adequately monetized, because they want the soy, they want the palm oil. So it's a huge challenge.
Now, I will also add to the point that the trend of urbanization oftentimes happens in developing countries. So that's an opportunity to utilize new technology to decarbonize the built environment, to actually use the built environment as a way to sequester carbon rather than contributing to the problem.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, Jennifer, you were talking about how many more jobs come through a renewable energy economy.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, one of the things that we've got to recognize is that there are real needs for investment. I look at my colleagues in Africa, where the demographics are that most of the population is under 20. You are looking at an entire generation of people who need to have employment opportunities. So the investment is not just in terms of how do we ensure that we're getting the infrastructure. It's also that we're creating sustainable livelihoods and an economic pathway for the world's people. Now, it is critical that we recognize the need for an equitable, just transition, right? I mean, you can't have over hundreds of millions of coal workers in China or India or the United States, although we don't have very many left in the United States, without a job. So the question that we also have to grapple with in this transition is the equity is not just between countries, it's within our own communities, it's within our own countries, and managing for the social, economic, and political implications of a different economic order. And so we can't, each of our institutions, whether you're in a developing country context or in the OECD, you have to recognize that these are the brunt of the shift is not borne equitably, and that some people are in better positions to manage either the economic change or, frankly, the climate change, right? We've seen what happened in the COVID crisis around equity and the fact that many people who were on the margins have fallen back into poverty as a result of the fact that we have not navigated or managed the growing inequity. 600 million people still do not have access to electricity around the world. Those are even more exacerbated when you're talking about climate impacts over time. And we have the opportunity now to look at these issues of equity between countries and making sure we have the right climate finance agenda, and within countries to make sure that we're managing for those who have wealth and those who are still struggling, and can we offer the opportunities that they need to contribute to a low carbon future.
Thank you. That's great, all of you. Here's another question. Do you think it would be a good thing, an advantage, if there were agreement globally on a common price on carbon, common price for the emissions of carbon? And if so, any ideas how to get there?
This is a difficult one. I'm just gonna say that I think there are. A price on carbon is an essential component of what it will take. We have to internalize those externalities. We have to recognize the need for a carbon price. However, as a pragmatist and as somebody who really is focused on what do we do in these next 5 years to get us on the right path, waiting for a carbon price is not my primary focus. I'm really would encourage everyone to think today about what it takes to get on that trajectory currently. We know that it's going to be a combination of carbon pricing and sectoral strategies and interventions. You manage for the built environment with a specific set of opportunities that you can take today to change that sector. Carbon price may help us, but it's not the only mechanism.
Yeah, I'd say I'm in Jennifer's camp that it's been the carbon impacts of our built environment and energy decisions has been an externality for so long that to play around to try to adjust that by adding a price to it, in a global world where energy pricing is anything but economically just or fair or untinkered with, right? It is not a free market. We'd be at this for decades trying to figure out what the price is to drive the change, and we've seen how long it took Europe's trading scheme to actually have a price that resulted in change as opposed to just transfers of dollars. That we don't have the time, right? I mean, we need a performance standard and a regulatory regime that gets us there. We have 3 decades to bend the curve or to completely get to net zero. And we have 1 decade maybe to bend the curve in a significant way to get us on that pathway. And there isn't an example of a pricing scheme globally that's done that type of transformational impact. So I would not. I agree with it from a philosophical standpoint. That'd be nice if we could do that, but I think the time is long past to actually have that be the prime mover of the change we need.
Yeah, it's putting on the economist hat, it's the most efficient way to incentivize carbon reductions if you really had that price there. But you mentioned the EU, they have their emissions trading scheme and a carbon price in place, and they're devoting enormous energy to how to make it fair for their industry when they're dealing with imports from countries that do not have a carbon price. So that's an issue. Okay,
to add like one quick caveat, I do think there's
Very quick.
there's opportunity at the local level. I am a big fan of building trading schemes so that we're investing in carbon reduction in affordable housing, in buildings that don't have resources. At the a municipal trading scheme in the built environment, I think makes a lot of sense to to your points.
A lot of good market-based instruments out there that are being deployed in various places. We are almost out of time. We got a question in from the audience that I think is sort of a perfect wrap-up. You each have less than a minute to speak very quickly, but I'll pose the question and you can either answer it or give any other last thought, which is climate change. Is it a political question, a science tech question, an economics question, or a social question? And Steve is ready to take us out. So maybe you just have
The political question.
one word, political question. Okay, one word answers.
I would say it's all of the above.
That's 4 words. Okay, Brian?
I'd say it's political and social.
Great. Steve, back to you. Thanks everybody so much.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And I would have answered your question by saying yes. So I think I agree with Victor. Wow, what an incredible presentation. Clearly a lot of expertise from the panel. We thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I was looking at the questions that came in, and I know you addressed, at least in part, most of them, but there were some that we couldn't get to, and that's a shame. But we could spend a whole Pan-Asia reunion in person where we're together for 2 or 3 days talking just about this issue because it is so important for us. And I would say at the same time, you frightened me greatly today, and you gave me some hope that there are answers that will help us get through this if we'll just be wise and listen and think and make the right decisions. So we need more people like you out there telling the story. Thank you very much for that. We really appreciate it. I also really want to thank our participants, all of the alumni from around the world who have been on the call today. We appreciate you. You have an opportunity to influence this arena in your own backyards, if you will. But you do that for the University of Michigan all the time, anyhow. And I thank you for being great ambassadors for our university in the cities and towns in which you live, and how you represent us every day. Thank you for that. I look forward to seeing you again. In fact, I hope that you'll join us at the next virtual Pan-Asia event, which is going to be on February 24th. It'll be great with you for that session as well. Thank you all for joining us today. This will conclude the program. There's nothing better to say at this moment than, I hate to say go green, although from our standpoint of our session today, I do want us to be more green, but more importantly, go blue.